Please tell me I'm not losing my mind. It started last month when my mum passed away unexpectedly. Heart attack, they said. Found her in her study surrounded by all these old books and papers. That was my mom for you. Always researching something obscure. Always digging into histories that probably should have stayed buried. I should have known something was off right from the start. At the funeral, this strange old woman approached me. Had to be in her 90s, all hunched over with these intense grey eyes that seemed to look right through you. She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Your mother was a guardian. The responsibility passes to you now." Before I could ask what the hell she meant, she disappeared into the crowd. Trust me, I looked for her. Nobody else seemed to remember seeing her. I started dealing with Mom's estate. She wasn't wealthy by any means, but she had this habit of collecting, well, everything. Our house was cluttered but manageable. It wasn't until I found the paperwork in her study that I realized she had 3 storage units across town. 3. And, get this, she'd been paying for them for over 20 years. The first unit was what you'd expect. Old furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations, photo albums, the usual stuff. Took me a weekend to sort through it all. Found some nice vintage pieces that will probably sell well. The second unit was mostly books. Thousands of them. Many in languages I didn't recognize, with these weird symbols on the spines. I found her research notes scattered throughout. Something about containing malevolent energies and generational obligations. I figured it was research for one of her books. Mom wrote horror novels under a pen name, though I never saw them in any bookstores. But that third unit? God, that third unit! Here's where everything went sideways. First off, it was triple the price of the others. When I asked the facility manager about it, this nervous guy named Steve, who always seemed to be sweating, he got really weird. Said Mom had specifically requested Unit 313, even waited 6 months for it to become available. She'd paid 5 years in advance and left strict instructions that the payment was to be automatically renewed. Your mom? Steve hesitated, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. She would come here every full moon, like clockwork, always at midnight, always alone. That set off all kinds of alarm bells, but I figured maybe Mom just had some weird routines in her later years. Grief does strange things to your perception of someone you thought you knew. The unit itself was in a separate building from the others, tucked away in a corner where the security cameras didn't quite reach. The lock was this massive antique thing, all black iron with those same weird symbols I'd seen on the books. The key was in Mom's desk drawer, wrapped in silk with a note. 313, do not lose. Life depends on it. I showed up at 8 a.m. on a Saturday, figuring I'd knock it out in one day. The moment I turned that key, the air changed. You know how the air feels different right before a massive storm. Heavy, electric, like reality is holding its breath. It was like that, but worse. The unit was smaller than the others, but felt deeper, somehow. Like the back wall was further away than it should have been. The whole space was filled with these identical steamer trunks, stacked floor to ceiling. Each one had to be at least 100 years old, made of dark wood with brass fittings. And those symbols again, carved into each lock. The smell hit me next. Not musty like you'd expect, but something sweeter, like incense mixed with copper. It reminded me of the time I'd visited this ancient church in New Orleans. I decided to start with the trunk nearest the door. It was surprisingly light, almost like it was empty. The lock clicked open with no key, Just a light touch to those symbols. Inside, nothing. Completely empty. Not even dust. I moved to the next one. Same thing. Empty. Third trunk. Empty again. That's when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound coming from behind me. I turned back to the first trunk, and my heart nearly stopped. There was something in it now. A black and white photograph. One of those old-fashioned family portraits from the 1800s. Mother, father, 3 children, all in their Sunday best. But their faces... God, their faces were scratched out with what looked like claw marks. And they weren't just scratched out in the photo. It looked like something had clawed its way out of the photo. The scratching got louder. Not just from one trunk now, but from all of them. The symbols on the locks began to move, rearranging themselves like living things. The air got colder, heavy with that sweet metallic smell. My phone started spazzing out. The screen flickered between apps, then went black. When it came back on, I had 47 missed calls, all from Mom's number. A text appeared from an unknown number. Please close the door. They've been waiting so long. So very long. Another text. Your mother understood. She kept us fed. Another. We're so hungry. The scratching turned to pounding. The trunk started to shake. In the gaps between them, I saw movement. Dark shapes that shouldn't exist. Twisting in ways that hurt my eyes. And faces. God, those faces. Pressing against invisible barriers. Their features all wrong. That's when I noticed the floor. Dark liquid was seeping out from under the trunks, forming patterns that matched the symbols on the locks. It was spreading toward my feet in a way that seemed deliberate. I ran, slammed the door so hard the whole unit rattled. I could still hear them in there, scratching, pounding, whispering in voices that felt like ice down my spine. I bolted to the office, practically fell through the door. Steve took one look at me, and his face went grey. You saw them, he said. It wasn't a question. Turns out my mum wasn't the first guardian of Unit 315. The previous renter, an old man named Marcus Pierce, had disappeared 3 years before Mom took over. They found his car in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition. The only trace of him was a journal in his apartment, filled with the same symbols from the locks and one final entry. They must stay contained. The price must be paid. The next day, I went back with Steve and the police. The unit was empty. Completely empty. No trunks, no photographs, not even a dust bunny. Just that sickly sweet smell and a note in my mom's handwriting. My darling daughter, some doors were never meant to be opened. Some responsibilities can't be ignored. I'm sorry for the burden I've passed to you, but they must be contained. They must be fed. The full moon comes soon. All my love, Mom. I found more of her research after that. The symbols, the trunks, they're part of something old. Something that's been passed down through certain families for generations. The trunks don't hold things. They're prisons. And now, they're my responsibility. I signed the unit over to the facility temporarily, but I know that's not the end. Every full moon, my phone lights up with texts from unknown numbers. Sometimes it's just those symbols. Sometimes it's worse. Last night I found an old photo album I'd never seen before. Inside was that same family portrait from the trunk, but this one was intact. The family's faces were clear as day. It was my mother's family. My grandparents, my aunts and uncles who disappeared before I was born. All smiling at the camera like they knew something I didn't. And on the last page, A recent photo of that storage unit. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, stand 5 figures. Their faces are turned away, but I know what I'll see if they turn around. The full moon is tomorrow night. I've been researching the symbols, learning what Mom knew. I found her ritual books. I know what needs to be done. If you're ever in town and come across Unit 313, just keep walking. Don't look too long at the symbols. Don't listen if you hear scratching. And if you get a text from an unknown number talking about hunger, block it! Block it immediately! Some things are meant to stay locked away. Some doors should never be opened. And some inheritances are darker than others.